Our first speaker this morning is Alva Noë. He's professor of philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley, where he's also a member of the Center for New Media and the Institute for Cognitive and Brain Sciences. He's the author of a number of books, Action and Perception, the one that I first read, Out of Our Heads, Why You Are Not Your Brain, and Other Lessons from the Biology of Consciousness. I took some comfort in knowing I'm not my brain. I didn't think I was my brain, but it helped to know. Varieties of Presence, another book, Strange Tools, Art and Human Nature, which will be part of his talk today, and then most recently, Infinite Baseball, Notes from a Philosopher at the Ballpark. He was a 2012 recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and then a 2018 recipient of the Judd Hume Prize in Advanced Visual Studies. Responding to Alva this morning will be Talbot Brewer, known to most of us, professor of philosophy here at UVA, senior fellow of the Institute. He specializes in ethics and political philosophy, with particular attention to moral psychology and Aristotelian ethics. He has published many essays, as well as 2 books, including most recently The Retrieval of Ethics. And he says, at least, that he's work on 2 other books. I say that because we had planned to have a book manuscript workshop, which keeps getting postponed. One on Aristotelian action theory and ethics, and then another on what he calls tragedies of the cultural commons. So Alva will go first, then Tal. Then we will take a break, 15-minute break, whatever's on the schedule, and then Tanya will follow that. Okay, thanks, Alva.
Good morning. It's very good to be here. Better late than never. And I had a chance to walk around this morning and enjoy this beautiful day and beautiful campus. And I thank you for the invitation. And it's good to see Tal, who was a graduate student with me back a long time ago now. I wanted to actually begin sort of by way of introducing myself to the room, but also in the spirit of reminiscence, to say that I am a philosopher. I did a PhD in philosophy, but back in graduate school, I was especially interested in ways of thinking about philosophy, starting in empirical studies of the issues that I was interested in philosophy. Is my voice carrying adequately to the back of the room? Can you hear me? Yeah? And I took a lot of courses at Harvard and nearby at MIT on what is called vision science. And I found myself, this came back to me some years ago, I found myself one day in a conversation with an older guy who was an artist. And he said, "What is this thing, vision science? What do you do in vision science?" And I said, "Well, in vision science, we start with the idea that we're given 2 tiny, upside-down, distorted, jittery images in the eyes. And somehow on that basis, we enjoy the rich, dimensional, meaningful experience of the world all around us. How do we see so much on the basis of so little?" And I was very proud of myself for articulating the point that way. The man looked at me with astonishment and criticism. He sort of hissed through his teeth and furrowed his brow and said, "That doesn't seem like the interesting question. The more interesting question is not how do we see so much on the basis of so little, but why do we see so little when there's so much around us to see?" And maybe like some of you right now, my first thought was, oh, he didn't get it. He didn't get the point. He didn't get the puzzle. And I thought, maybe he's an idiot. Because he was my father, I found out a convenient and plausible hypothesis. Years went by, and I did work in the philosophy of mind and philosophy of perception, and realized at some point along the journey that actually I'd been influenced rather profoundly by that conversation. And I started to reflect on it, and I thought that to these two questions, how do we see so much on the basis of so little? And why do we see so little when there's so much around us? There really correspond to quite fundamentally different ways of thinking about what experience is or what perceptual consciousness is. On one way, perception is something which is activated in us by the action of the world on our sensory systems, our brains. But on the other, experience is this thing that we do, that we perform, or that we enact, and that we can fail in interesting ways to achieve or to perform. And in fact, and now this is sort of in the vein of introducing myself to people that don't know my work, much of my work has been trying to develop an idea that corresponds to that second question and that second conception of experience. I've championed a way of thinking about perception, which is sometimes called the enactive approach, according to which precisely I say we shouldn't think of perception as something happening in you, although of course it depends on stuff happening in you, but think of it as something we do or something we enact with our whole persons, our whole bodies, situated in an environment, including a cultural environment. The reason from this perspective why we haven't managed to explain perceptual consciousness in neural terms alone is that in a sense we're looking in the wrong place when we try to do that. Don't look in to the brain, have to, as the title of that book has it, have to get out of our heads and look at the way we are involved with the world around us. And I actually took that to be consistent with a sounder biological approach to what it is to be human, hence the subtitle of that book. So Why You Are Not Your Brains and Other Lessons from the Biology of Consciousness. But another reason why I wanted to share that with you this morning is that as time went on even further, I began to realize that it was interesting that that perspective, that insight that my father had, if you'll agree with me that it was an insight, or just for the sake of argument, that insight kind of grew out of his work as an artist and his reflections on experience from concerns in the arts. And this is very interesting because in the academy, less so in the cultural studies more broadly considered, but certainly in the social sciences and in the in cognitive sciences and especially in, I think, analytic philosophy, there's a tendency when we turn to the question of art to think we're going to explain art, which is this phenomenon. But the thought that, and this is quite a naive idea, but it was quite moving for me to come to it, the thought that maybe art is its own legitimate source of understanding that could allow art and artists to be collaborators in our investigation into, say, the nature of perception and consciousness or human being writ large, rather than an object of study for us to explain under glass, as it were, was a very powerful suggestion for me. So that book, Strange Tools, was very much a book trying to think about the idea, well, if art is in some ways a source of understanding or a source of knowledge, how should we model that? People in the arts, and maybe some of you are artists, will in some ways find this a familiar idea. The idea of art as research is now kind of almost a cliche. But then that just raises the question, well, if it's research, what kind of research is it, and how do we relate it to other forms of learning and knowing that we are interested in? So I'm going to touch on some of these themes in my presentation today, but you can think of the remarks I've just shared with you as kind of a general background about where I'm coming from. Now, my title is Art at the Limits of Neuroscience. If we define neuroaesthetics as the use of the methods and concepts of neuroscience to explain art and aesthetic experience, then, I believe, the prospects for neuroaesthetics are grim. Indeed, neuroaesthetics, thought of this way, is almost certainly impossible. And I want to be clear up front that my aim is not to say no to neuroscience. My concern is that neuroscience ends up saying no to art. So I want to find a way to say yes to art. My worry is that neuroscience ends up not bringing art into focus when it tries to study art. One little joke, which I've made once before in a public forum, so I hope you haven't heard this already. But Joe introduced me correctly as Alva Noë, But I'm very often introduced as Alva Noë. People see that name and they mispronounce it. So I'm sort of hypersensitive to being negative. I don't want to be a no person. I want to be a yes person. So my aim rather is to say yes to art. And my worry is that neuroscience doesn't know how to do that. Here's why. Neuroscientists working on art almost universally assume what I call the trigger conception of art. According to the trigger conception of art, artworks are stimuli that trigger a special kind of event, the aesthetic experience, in us. And I think this trigger conception is wrong at both ends. Aesthetic experiences are not best thought of as triggered in us, and artworks are not triggers. So let me explain these points in turn. So I begin with the idea that aesthetic experiences are not triggered in us. First, aesthetic experiences do not trigger artworks do not trigger aesthetic experiences. This is because in the relevant sense that I'm going to try to explain, there are no aesthetic experiences. That is, aesthetic experiences are not episodes in consciousness, like sensory episodes, that start and stop, anchored in exposure to a stimulus. In this sense, they are not experiences, as the term is often used in consciousness research and philosophy. So here are some considerations to support this idea. 1, your aesthetic experience of a painting, say, is not identical to the perceptual experience of the painting. For one thing, the aesthetic experience needn't stop when you look away to read the wall text, for example, or to talk to a friend about the painting, or to take notes on what you are looking at, or to look at other paintings in the same gallery. For another, you can perceive the painting and fail to have any aesthetic response at all. So seeing is one thing, aesthetic experience something else, and I think the same goes for art in other modalities. Some works of art, for example, those of Charles Atlas, just to mention someone arbitrarily, or some works in electronic music, may deliberately target perceptual neurological effects. But even in these cases, it seems dubious that the sensory impact is the aesthetic experience rather than its occasion. 2, you might think that if the experience isn't perceptual, then it must be cognitive or emotional or bodily or empathetic or motor or whatever. But a striking feature of aesthetic experience, I would propose, is that although it is never one or the other of these exhaustively, it's always, in a sense, all of these. Experiences of art, and I'm going to come back to this later, are thickly, densely multimodal. They're emotional and perceptual and cognitive and bodily and cultural and biological. 3, suppose you read a poem or go to the theater. You can time how long it takes you to read the poem or how long you sit watching the play, but you won't thereby have measured the duration of your aesthetic experience. How long does your aesthetic experience last? For as long as the play lasted? For as long as you think about it? Whenever you think about it? These questions don't quite make sense, I think, which shows that aesthetic experiences are not creatures of time, like headaches, which is not to say that they have no temporality. My suggestion is that aesthetic experiences are less like headaches or perceptual episodes and more like patterns of curiosity, interest, or caring. An aesthetic experience isn't the sort of thing that happens once and for all, but for the same reason that one's concern for a political cause or interest in a person doesn't happen once and for all, which is not to say that our commitments, interests, and caring can't change or that they are outside of time. 4, nor are responses to artworks singular or stable. This is important. Initial responses, finding something absorbing or boring or wonderful or meaningless, liking it, whatever, are dynamic and changing. So you can't point to a single effect, a single response, the occurrence of which we might try to explain. It's sometimes said that an initial response is accurate in the sense that it predicts one's final settled response, but I don't think there is any such thing. 5, aesthetic experience varies, as I've just been saying, but it does so characteristically in the setting of conversation and critical exchange with other people. We bring artworks into focus together through shared thought, through shared culture. Aesthetic experience, insofar as it is a phenomenon at all, is essentially a cultural phenomenon. That is, it unfurls in a space of thought and talk, a space of what I call criticism. And so, in an important sense, it is not private or individual. Note, to say that it is a critical phenomenon is not to say that it is primarily or even predominantly intellectual. 6, finding the words to describe or characterize your aesthetic response, trying to articulate your aesthetic response, is itself a critical act, a creative act, and maybe also an emotional one. It's not something that can be taken for granted. Again, nor is it something we typically do on our own, individually, simply in one-on-one response to an artwork thought of as a stimulus atom. We strive to have aesthetic experience, and we do so always, already, as members of a culture, and in particular an art culture. 7, and this is the last point, aesthetic experiences don't come for free, as it were, just for the price of admission to the gallery or the theater or whatever. We may fail to frame any response to the work of art. We may even fail to perceive it, even as we look at it or perceptually take it in. It can be difficult, and we need to make an effort. We need to care, and we cannot always care or care about everything. And sometimes we need to be taught to care by the artwork, sometimes, in a dialogue with it, or by our friends, or by critics, or by our teachers. So for me, the upshot of these 7 comments is that, in a sense, there's no fixed datum, the aesthetic experience, that occurs in the individual, and that can then be studied using the methods of psychophysics or brain imaging or any other such means of neural analysis. Aesthetic experience is something persons, not brains, undertake, and they do so with others against the background of culture and history. Now, none of this, I think, is going to be very surprising to people who, like me, have already said yes to art. And I want to be very explicit that what I am suggesting or what I'm arguing is not to deny that you can study what happens in the brain when we do all the different things we do when we are aesthetically engaged with artworks, such as looking, listening, thinking, arguing, describing, associating, learning, reading, etc. But it is to deny that such neural studies are studies of the aesthetic experience. And consider also that I think it is unlikely that there is going to be an interesting unity among the neural substrates of all those different things that one does when one perceives a work of art, when one engages it. Such a structure of looking, listening, thinking, reading, arguing, remembering, distributed in time as it may be, is just too disunited to have a plausible, interesting neural correlate. And anyway, even if there is something that seems to gel at the neural level and jump out as a candidate for the neural correlate of the aesthetic experience, it's unlikely that it will shed light on the aesthetic experience. For how can information about what is going on in my nervous system unfolding beneath awareness at the time scales of milliseconds contribute to that ongoing thoughtful exchange that you and I all together have with the works of art that interest us? How can it bear on the art? Now, you might be tempted to adopt a divide and conquer strategy. Granted, you might conceive, we can't bring aesthetic experience into focus in our laboratory, but we can look at something simpler, and we could hypothesize related, such as preference judgments, or reports about the degree to which we find an art stimulus moving. And I think there are roughly 3 problems with this kind of approach. By the way, the idea that we can use movingness as a sort of proxy for art is one that a lot of work has been done on. Gabrielle Starr, the literary theorist, wrote a book developing that idea based on work that she'd done in collaboration with the neuroscientist Ed Wessel. He's now at the Max Planck Institute the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics in Frankfurt. But here are 3 reasons why I'm skeptical of that sort of approach. Finding something moving, or liking it, isn't necessary or sufficient for finding it aesthetically significant. I may not like the art that I value, and merely liking something may not be enough to value it aesthetically. I may not be moved by a work I value, and I may be moved by work I don't value. Interestingly, I may find a single work moving sometimes, but not at other times. I might learn to find it moving, or come to find it no longer moving. And the same is true, I think, for all the other proxies for aesthetic experience that I can think of. 2, insofar as we can collect data on preference or movingness or vividness of imagery or whatever, insofar as these really can become fixed points whose meaning is secure, then this is probably because we've stepped outside of the domain of the aesthetic. I say this because I think of a liking response to a work of art not as it were, the aesthetic experience or judgment or evaluation itself, but rather one moment, maybe just the initiation of the relevant aesthetic encounter. There's liking and disliking, but then there's all this, I think, quite transformative work of trying to find the words to say why one responds as one does. Finding the words to explain or justify or make sense of the response is productive. It very often changes our response as we do it. So to separate isolated responses or judgments about liking or emotional power or how much you love something or its vividness or whatever from all those transforming, varying conversations about the work is, I think, to give up looking at the aesthetic at all. Now, you might object that this is unfair to the neuroscientific approach, for neuroscience, as any science does, has to simplify, to detach aspects and parts in order to get experimental purchase on the phenomenon. And I appreciate this response, but this awkward impasse is the consequence, I think, of insisting on saying yes to art. It is false to the phenomenon of art in our lives to pretend that liking responses or rating something on a movingness scale from 1 to 4 track what matters when aesthetic meaning is at question. All this is related, this is the 3rd point, to the fact that liking or finding something moving, what those terms mean in an art context is often up for grabs. Is an ancoara moving or a soloist? The very meaning of the term moving needs to be reinvented or at least explored when we try to use it in question with artists like those. We certainly can't assume any freestanding metric for making evaluations or comparisons among artists. One way to bring this out, when we respond to an artwork seriously by expressing our love of it or how moving we find it or how vividly we experience its images, we are not implying, I would argue, artist or content neutral or, as it were, external terms of appraisal or expressions of feeling. We are engaging with the artwork and inventing those terms inside the space of considerations that the artwork itself or the cultural context in which we encounter the artwork makes available. All right, so everything I've been saying so far has been raising this question. I've been criticizing one aspect of the trigger conception. In particular, I've been suggesting that it's a mistake, that the trigger conception makes a mistake in taking for granted that aesthetic experiences are timeable, operationalizable, stable, fixed episodes in consciousness that occur inside individuals and that can be held constant for the purpose of uncovering their neural substrates. And just for the purposes of cleansing the palate, I'll just show you, I'll repeat what I've just said in a few slides. So aesthetic experiences are not triggered in us. Here are my 7 points. Aesthetic experiences are not perceptual episodes. Aesthetic experiences are thickly, densely multimodal. Aesthetic experiences are not creatures of time like headaches. Aesthetic responses are not singular or stable. Aesthetic experience is a critical phenomenon, by which I mean it exists in the setting of our conversations and attempts to articulate and make sense of what we're seeing with each other. Aesthetic experience is something we achieve as members of a culture, and aesthetic experience doesn't come for free. You have to work at it. But I also believe that the other part of this, namely the idea that artwork should be thought of as triggers, is questionable. And let me say a few brief words about this. No doubt, insofar as the artwork is a material or concrete entity, insofar as it is a song or a sculpture or a painting, then it will be liable to trigger perceptual or emotional or kinesthetic or empathetic responses in perceivers. But that's true of anything and has nothing distinctively to do with its status as an artwork. A Mondrian will activate color areas in the brain, and a dance may activate systems required for action perception. But so will a colorful ad in the newspaper or a glimpse of the crush of passengers during the morning commute, respectively. Insofar as works of art are perceptible, then our experiences of them depend on the activation of capacities and neural substrates necessary for such perception. But to see the Mondrian is not merely to see a colorful surface, and to see the dance is not merely to perceive people moving. The art in these things does not consist in a disposition to trigger that sort of response, but rather, I would say, here's my alternative to the idea of art as trigger, it's rather the artwork provides us the opportunity, not so much a trigger, but an opportunity to react, that is to think, look, judge, feel, but also catch ourselves in the act of looking, thinking, feeling, striving to articulate. So the work of art is not a trigger, it's an opportunity. One upshot of this is that although art is specific, concrete, maybe specific, concrete material, typically what differentiates works of art from any other item of human manufacture or technology, from other artifacts, other concrete, specific things that we make, is what I will call, in an admittedly non-standard use of this term, its logical standing. To illustrate what I mean by logical standing, consider this example. The model unit in an apartment complex. The model unit may be physically identical to any one of the homes, but it's a different kind of thing. It's a display, a thing for show. It's a model. The same, I think, is true of works of art. The artwork may be a picture, but it no more functions straightforwardly as a picture than the model unit functions as a home. Similarly, I think for a choreographic work, however much it looks like dancing, it's not just dancing. Art plays a different logical role. I think there's a very simple marker for this distinct art role. When human makings are put to work logically or rhetorically as art, we can never rely on or take for granted prior independent standards when it comes to making sense of them or evaluating them. Pictorial works of art ask questions, for example, about what it is to be a picture or what it is to see something in a picture. And choreography, again, insofar as we restrict our attention to choreography that is grounded in dancing, not all choreography is grounded in dancing. Some choreography takes inspiration from other forms of human movement. But insofar as it is grounded in dancing, it poses questions along the lines of what do you see when you look at people dancing, or what is dancing anyway. So I began by expressing pessimism about neuroaesthetics on the assumption that we define it as the use of neuroscience to explain art and aesthetic experience. The reason finally why neuroaesthetics thought of this way fails is that art isn't a phenomenon, neurological or experiential, to be explained. It is rather itself a mode of questioning or inquiry. So my favorite quote that captures this thought is from James Baldwin. Art aims to uncover the questions that have been occluded by the answers. And to summarize these last remarks I've made about why we shouldn't think of the artwork as a trigger, again, this is just looking back at what I've just said. The artwork is an opportunity. The artwork is a thing with a particular logical standing. We cannot rely on given standards for making sense of artworks. So maybe then we need to rethink how we define neuroaesthetics. And let me just very briefly try to suggest what an alternative conception might be. One that actually I think may be thriving. The alternative conception would start with the dual propositions that art aims at a distinct kind of understanding, something like, just as a sort of placeholder, philosophical understanding, and that neuroscience, for its part, is less the name of a settled discipline whose standards of success and failure are already quite clear, but rather denotes a field that seeks to frame, as we have not yet managed to frame, a truly adequate conception, a truly adequate biological conception of what it is to be a human being. Neuroscience, thought of in this more expansive sense, comprises philosophy, and neuroaesthetics then can be our term for the project of looking to art for a better insight in what it is to be human. On this way of thinking of neuroaesthetics, it's not the application of neuroscience to art, it is or could be the turning to art as a resource for helping us work towards a more adequate neuroscience, that is, a more adequate conception of ourselves. So touching on that theme that I mentioned at the very beginning, sort of turning the tables, using art to explain us rather than our philosophy or our science to explain art. Now, I thought I would conclude with a work of art. Again, I like palate cleansing exercises or pauses in thought processes, but so to change things up, and this will take just a few moments, and then I'll be done. This is a poem taken from, it's Walt Whitman, from Leaves of Grass. I hear the trained soprano. She convulses me like the climax of my love grip. The orchestra whirls me wider than Uranus flies. It wrenches unnameable ardors from my breast. It throbs me to gulps of the farthest down horror. It sails me. I dab with bare feet. They are licked by the indolent waves. I am exposed, cut by bitter and poisoned hail, steeped amid honeyed morphine, my windpipe squeezed in the fakes of death, led up again to feel the puzzle of puzzles, and that we call being. Now, this is remarkable, I think, in that it is a poem about aesthetic experience. And it's a poem that, in a way, every single one of the points I made, I feel, is inside this poem. I mean, it's a poem about the work of art, and actually an interesting thing about art is how much it is almost always in some way, either explicitly or implicitly in dialogue with other art. And it's interesting how to think about how that gets worked into or doesn't get worked into a neuroaesthetic perspective. But the most salient thing that first pops out at you in this poem, and this was something emphasized by Elinda Saniaki in her writing, is that he's calling attention to the bodily, biological, visceral appetitive or sensual, like sex, like food, qualities of aesthetic experience. But he does that while at the same time very clearly embedding his experience here of art in a pretty thick cultural context. After all, it's a soprano, a trained soprano, a member of a trained musical culture, of a culture, our kind of culture, and her orchestra. So he's actually imagining, I picture him in some sort of not species ancient expression of ecstasy, but rather embedded in listening to a performance, a concert. So this is biological and cultural. He's describing something which is emotional, unnamed ardors. But he's also describing something highly intellectual, unnamed ardors, and yet this is a setting of a kind of involving a sort of a cultural literacy. So you've got biology and culture, you've got emotion and intellect. So here I think Whitman is underscoring what I mean by the thickly multimodal character of the experience. And I think it's really that fact more than any other that makes me suspicious that something as holistic as that is likely to have interesting neural correlates. The last point I'll make is that the poem ends by his saying that when we sort of, as he comes up for air, as it were, what he encounters is the puzzle of puzzles, and that we call being. I can't think of a better way of characterizing the preoccupations and concerns of philosophy than the puzzle of human being. And so I think the suggestion here is that art is a setting in which we try to engage those puzzles. And with that, I'll bring my presentation to a conclusion. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Alva. That is such a beautiful presentation, such a beautiful paper, and it's daunting to try to tinker with such a work of art. I feel that I need time to let that experience sort of sink in and to process it, to have it, right? It's just a beautiful paper. So many interesting claims, so many interesting ideas, suggestions, directions for thought. I want to begin with one. It is the way you describe the experience of art and the way in which we enter into conversation with a particular work of art. We don't sort of back away from the experience that is being caused in us by the artwork and think critically about the aptness or inaptness of that experience. We experience art and begin to wield our critical sense of how to react to it through the experience itself in conversation with the work. And we, in a way, let the artwork tell us how to see it. You used language somewhere in that neighborhood at one point during your paper, and I found that language quite striking. And it seems to me that this is essential to aesthetic experience. An experience wouldn't be an aesthetic experience if it weren't subject to standards, but standards that we can't articulate once and for all and wield each time we round back to the encounter with a work of art. They're standards that are somehow more mysterious than that. So we can, gesture towards the names of, improvement and deficiency and so on and so forth, with words like sentimentality and depth and shallowness and so on and so forth. But these are nothing that could be wielded by way of a guideline for responding better. The only way to attain to the depths, to avoid sentimentality, to arrive at a just and discerning experience of a work of art is to expose ourselves to it and have the experience. And the way in which the improvement, the replacement experience that seems like a step forward dawns on us is by, in a way, replacing the experience that we've already had. And so it seems to me essential to this particular kind of experience that it has to be labile in the way that you have, and temporally extended, or at least potentially temporally extended in the way that you've suggested. I mean, you could imagine a meteor striking somebody who's just beginning to have an experience of a work of art, and that experience, you might say, was frozen in time and yet counts as this aesthetic. But the reason that it seems to me still to be open to the analysis that you've offered is that if it really is an aesthetic experience, then it is essentially such that it's the kind of thing that we can look through and that is subject to being deepened and improved by conversation with that which it is directed toward. And again, the deepening and improvement is not something that we arrive at by wielding a blueprint for making such improvements. There is no general blueprint like that. Rather, and people might say things about how we might look at this work of art. We might have conversations. We might think about what we know about the development of the genre that the work of art is a part of, about the history, about the context within which it was, painted or composed or whatever it may be. But all of those prods to greater depth in our responsiveness to and uptake of the work of art will yield a step forward only if the step forward materializes in our actual appreciation of the work as a replacement experience that sort of dawns on us while directing our attention either in memory or directly and in person to the work of art. And so it seems to me, again, I want to say, if something weren't subject to that sort of improvement and under the demand to quest for that kind of improvement, then it wouldn't be the aesthetic experience of a work of art. And so it seems to me essential that, artworks have just the kind of instability, the room for change, and for perpetually being revisited, and the bizarre sort of the interesting sort of temporality that you've directed your attention at. It seems to me to spill out of a plausible conception of how the relevant norms, the ones that bear on this particular kind of experience, are wielded and answered to, even if only approximately, right? And so I really resonate with the ideas that you're putting forward, and this is all just by way of sort of framing them from a slightly different angle and agreeing heartily, saying yes to Dr. Noë, right? And thank you for that. Now, I want to ask about what you think the scope of this set of points might be. So I began to think about experiences that we wouldn't naturally call or immediately call aesthetic, and with raising the question, well, are they similar, right? Should we say something similar about them? And when I thought about religious experience, it seems to me that all of the same points are going to play out. All of your points, it seems to me, are wieldable. Or at least the points that are most essential to the contestation to the thought that this sort of experience could be apprehended via a punctual reading of brain states. That seems to me to be fully in play in the case of religious experience. It seems to me, again, that we have something that, is perpetually open to a revisiting, and that we can be in and perhaps are called to be in a kind of a conversation with, and that is, the stuff of, it's a window to, or an opportunity for growth, and growth by a kind of a concentration, conversation, dialectical revisiting of the source of the experience. And so it seemed to me that something very similar should be said about religious experience. And then I thought about, the experience of, loving somebody, falling in love, being wrapped up in a loving relationship. And it seems to me, again, that the central experiences there have all of the markers that you have drawn our attention to that stand in the way of at least a straightforward and flat-footed neurological approach to the study of this sort of experience. I thought about contemplation and many other examples that seem to me to suggest themselves for similar treatment. Then I thought back to Bill's paper yesterday, where he offered us a couple of sort of exemplary and beautiful and beautifully described experiences from a book about somebody who has, I don't know, indulged in what we might call the art of swimming. This is a person who has made it his life calling, or at least an important part of his life calling, to visit very beautiful natural areas which afford an opportunity for swimming, sometimes shockingly cold swimming, but for abandoning oneself into the bodily experience, the wet bodily experience of a body of water, a river, an ocean, whatever it may be. And the way that he describes these experiences seems to me to bring them into immediate, sort of opening to the kind of argument that Alva has offered here. Again, these seem to me to be the kinds of, he seems to be encountering his physical environment in such a way that its further openings, its revelation of its own further meaning is perpetually revisitable and is always a work in progress, and so that the experience is not something that he had at a particular time on the coast of Wales or a particular time on the Cornwall coast or what have you, but rather these are works in progress, right? Experiences that are still unfolding and that are part of his life, and whose revisiting and re-experiencing is part and parcel of the experience itself. So I began to think that really the field of application for this point might be rather wide. And I looked at this passage on page 5, where you make some, I think, very striking and I think on target claims about aesthetic experience. And I wondered if we could put life experience in there and, have a paragraph that came out, just as striking and just as convincing. So that I'll just, where you have aesthetic, I'll put life, and I think that way I won't have to read it twice, and I think you'll get the point, and at least be able to frame the question whether maybe this expansion of the thought would be tempting. Upshot. There is no fixed datum, you say the aesthetic experience, I want to say life experience, that occurs in the individual and that can be studied using the methods of psychophysics or brain imaging or other such means of neural analysis. Life experience is something persons, not brains, undertake, and they do so always in the setting of others and against the backdrop of a culture and a history. That seems to me to be absolutely compelling. And, so because it's compelling, I mean, my excitement about this paper is sort of multiplied because it feels, so, immediately expandable into a more sweeping sort of, response to or next step in the conversation with, neurologically oriented inquirers into the human condition and, into human life. So I wondered if that's tempting to you. So maybe I'll just leave it there and let you, ruminate on and I don't know, tell me what you think of those suggestions. But again, the main thing I wanted to say is just how much I enjoyed reading the paper and benefited from it. Thank you.